Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the Henry George School. Our speaker tonight is Matthew Colantonio. Matt is a graduate of the Peter J. Tobin College of Business, where he earned a BS in business. After graduation, he worked as an AmeriCorps volunteer in local economic development in his hometown of Pittsburgh. He then earned a Master of Science in Applied Economics from Boston College. Matt currently works as a statistician for the Pennsylvania Department of Health in the Bureau of Informatics and Information Technology. Matt, the floor is yours.
All right. Yeah, thank you for the introduction, Ibrahim, and thank you for having me. I'm excited to share some of the work that I've done with everyone here. So thanks everyone for attending. All right, so I'm going to be talking about today residential property and local economic development in a Rust Belt city, and that city is my hometown of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. But this presentation really is an anthology of my work in economic development in the city, and some work that I did, empirical work that I did as a graduate student, and for different roles that I had in economic development in Pittsburgh. So my experience was shaped by my time working, in development in different capacities. Although full disclaimer, um, obviously the opinions that I express in this presentation don't reflect that of my former or current employer. Just those experience I use to sort of shape my perspective when looking at residential property in Pittsburgh, which I think is very unique and um, very relatable to Henry George's analysis. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we move along. So the agenda for today will sort of follow this trajectory. We'll give a little bit of the history of Pittsburgh, a history of the city, a history of property policy, and sort of the current state of things in Pittsburgh and in Allegheny County, the county that surrounds the city. And I want to present some econometric models to maybe help with our understanding of policy, look into, how, Henry George's perspective may be um, applied for future potential policy and impacts. All right, so starting with the history. So Pittsburgh and its city neighborhoods have long been associated with heavy industry. We all think of steel, of course, but even before the steel industry emerged in Pittsburgh, there was coal being mined in the hilltop neighborhoods. Lots of settlement by workers from Eastern Europe originally, and many of them immigrants. Strong employment, even with lower wages at times, could lead to communities that grew, different identities in different neighborhoods. Pittsburgh is really a city of neighborhoods. There's a lot of variation among the 90 or so neighborhoods that make up the city. And so those unique identities developed both in commercial and residential real estate, in those different dynamics. And sort of the general story that I want to highlight as we sort of get started here is the population growth and the population peaks and declines. Those sort of happen in step with industry in the city, and particularly the steel industry, as we all sort of associate with Pittsburgh. So fights for higher wages, often, put on by workers, were ended, violently. We think of the most famous probably incidents of the Homestead strikes. And, generally there was tension as the steel industry, sort of declined, sort of failed to adapt to competition overseas. International competition sort of was struggling to overcome even domestic competition from other domestic producers that were innovating in different ways to produce steel. that, in the conventional way that was being done in Pittsburgh was difficult in the way that, U.S. Steel, for example, was being operated, difficult to compete with. And ultimately, despite the industry leaders in U.S. Steel, corporate leadership sort of failing to adapt and compete with those other competitors, it was ultimately the workers that were blamed for the lack of competitiveness, that sort of struggle was ultimately not won by the workers, and was, in several instances violently, ended. And this decline in the steel industry, that loss of jobs, really was at the beginning of the decline in population in Pittsburgh and in Allegheny County. This had wide-ranging effects, not beyond just the immediate loss of jobs, but that loss of population leads into neighborhoods, you know with disinvestment occurring, increases in vacant or abandoned structures, loss of opportunity for wages, poverty, instances increasing, a sort of lack of opportunity in economic development. It took some time for the city to latch onto and attract different industry, and we could discuss later perhaps the role that land speculation maybe played a role in that situation. And then we have instances of brownfield sites. These are formerly industrial sites that are now looking to be converted to other uses. This can be made difficult due to chemical components on these sites, in these areas from their previous uses. It may be difficult to convert them to other uses. So, Pittsburgh is sort of experiencing, sort of put on by this initial loss in population, a whole series of negative impacts that are being seen in neighborhoods. And just we can visualize here just the decline in population of Allegheny County, which I think just recently, last year, I believe, had the first increase in population in over 40 years, I believe. And on the right, we can see some population density to look at. The darker blue areas would be the city of Pittsburgh proper. All right, and another, the focus of what I'm looking at today is really housing, and it's really important to address the legacy that Pittsburgh has of redlining and other racist practices in home lending and development within neighborhoods that really shaped helped shape the current status of housing development in Pittsburgh today, especially in communities of color. So initially, home loans were restricted often to certain groups of white applicants. In 1937, Homeowners Loan Corporation assumed and insisted that residency of African Americans and immigrants, as well as some working class whites, compromised the values of homes and the security of mortgages. So that limited then the availability of mortgages to people from these different groups, regardless of, their qualifications, really. And these redlining districts were created and adhered to, and the effects are visible today. And I created this little map on the right where it's sort of an overlay of current low and moderate income communities as defined by the Department of Housing and Urban Development. And those would be the areas in red, and then overlaid in the purple areas on the map are areas or neighborhoods that were initially redlined. by the Homeowners Loan Corporation in 1937. So those purple areas are the overlap of the red line districts and those districts that are currently today still in the low and moderate income range. And that's sort of just a visualization of looking at how those kind of policies can really still have a legacy almost 100 years later today. Those districts were can be seen in different metrics that we look at when considering community development and the populations of those neighborhoods today. And it's created a dynamic in Pittsburgh where it's difficult for Black residents to buy and own a home. There's a sort of well-read article from Bloomberg looking at the Pittsburgh slogan as a most livable city. But this may not be the case for Black women who on just about every metric would be better off in other cities in terms of economic mobility, health, a variety of factors. And that is a part of the looking at the history, addressing the history, and realizing that investment in Black communities needs to take a different route, and that formerly it's been really highways, construction through neighborhoods, parking lots, sports arenas, things of that nature. So in terms of moving forward with residential housing, addressing the history that race has played is imperative really in moving forward as a city. So talking a little bit about some of the econometric models, just some to stress again the importance here that abandoned properties play. This could be the result of the decline of industry, loss of population that I mentioned. This left structures abandoned and often in disrepair. We see a cycle forming of property abandonment, destabilization, and a loss in that built environment and the home as an asset. As Henry George talks about the value of the land coming from the community, as the community itself sort of disappears when we're talking about population specifically, that loss in the home or these properties, these parcels as an asset is clear and is extraordinary really in Pittsburgh. And an obvious downside to this, the low property values make flipping more attractive. So speculators can come in. It's easier with low acquisition costs to extract a profit from properties. And this is an issue for one reason because median rent in the most distressed tracts in the city, which I defined as having the most condemned properties. The median rent in the most distressed tracts is only about $160 per month less than the city average. So this low acquisition costs of abandoned or blighted structures make flipping and turning properties into rental properties more attractive, especially given that they can get almost the same gross median rent as they can in other neighborhoods that are further developed. In abandoned properties, obviously there's a lot of good empirical work on this. They reduce the value of nearby properties. They can present numerous health and safety issues. In terms of people entering the properties, they are unfit for human habitation. They can be structurally unsound. So there's issues besides just looking at the value of the property itself, but in terms of the health and safety of the the neighborhood. Many properties are city owned already. There's issues also with tangled titles. And ultimately there's a lack of consistent methodology for addressing vacancy within the city. Sometimes the city can move parcels along to the URA. There's more, roundabout conservatorship where, people living close to blighted properties can take over, properties that are, tax delinquent. There's some potential for large residential projects on former industrial sites. These are big projects. There's not, an unlimited number of those big, like brownfield sites that I mentioned earlier. So these may be, few and far between those bigger projects. Although I think there's been definitely some good progress on that. And then, zoning can present a different issue as well. We may discuss that a little bit more. Um, you know, what can developers do with vacant lots, for example? Is there a space to build more than single family detached structures in certain within certain zoning layouts that isn't possible. Another issue is the topographical factors. This is an issue that is, somewhat that is unique to Pittsburgh. The geographical features make building difficult in on different lots. Slope can make properties unstable. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Building costs can increase, because of this, and that limits the potential growth in land value over time. And when looking at these issues from the perspective of a developer, parcels must be profitable for development. And the good that we've discussed from the developer point of view, again, in Pittsburgh is the low acquisition costs of a lot of properties. But then the bad is this slope making development difficult. Lot size sometimes is small. It's difficult to build at scale and save costs in that sense. And then potentially those zoning issues that we just discussed. So again, bringing Henry George into this, of course, everybody works, but the vacant lot, vacant land is, at its core inefficient. And there's a need to rework some of the incentives around developing and discourage speculation in the typical sense. Generally, unearned rent here is made possible by the community, not the speculator. Important to remember that what Georgia brings to the discussion when it comes to redevelopment in the sense of Pittsburgh specifically is the focus on the community asset and the focus on the property as a community asset. Landowners are the capitalized rental values are able to be reclaimed in Henry George's proposal via the tax. And then that implies a loss if the dormant land is held. So this is one of the reasons I think Henry George's perspective and policy, not just as potential policy proposals to address some of these issues, but as sort of explaining the current state of the lack of equitable development in the city, I think is very relevant. So what I wanted to do for one was to address some of the property, structurally damaged and uninhabitable properties, of which Pittsburgh has many, for many of the reasons I discussed earlier. I wanted to build a model that predicted in a consistent fashion property condemnation, which is designated by the city. So I used parcel data for the city of Pittsburgh, supplemented with some census data and some information on slope, that topographical feature I mentioned earlier. And really I wanted to look at the coefficient interpretation of some different predictive models. to see what factors are consistent with property condemnation. Is it neighborhood demographics? Is there anything else we can glean from this kind of analysis? Besides that, it happens, most often in neighborhoods that, are lower income and, maybe lack the resources to take advantage of lower acquisition costs, and redevelop properties themselves. And the big, question also of why is in the most distressed census tracts in the city, the average distance from a condemned property is just 40 meters in the city. So, there's a need for, in sort of looking at being proactive in addressing property condemnation, what factors are correlated with the blight and vacancy and all those things that lead to property condemnation. So if from maybe a city authority perspective, you can look at those metrics within neighborhoods to look at allocating resources there. But then also looking at to maybe help explain a little bit the current situation of why there are so many condemned properties in certain neighborhoods. And then this is just a little graphic on some of the census tracts that have the most condemned properties, and then above that sort of split in the city average, and then those in those specifically areas that have the most condemned properties. Obviously, the income is very different. Interestingly, the tenure of the the parcel. So if it's owner occupied or it is the census tract, generally this is a percentage. So the percentage of residents that own their home versus rent. And discussing earlier that smaller relative difference in median rent in distress tracts, and in combine that with the fact that more residents in these areas are renters, you get, sort of a breeding ground for speculation in these properties, especially that have low acquisition costs to buy and flip and create rental properties. So, addressing some of some of the data problems, there was some imbalance. Obviously, it's good. Most properties are not condemned. I, mentioned that there are a lot of them, but, I think generally even the most, the tracts with the most condemned properties, only about 6% of properties are actually have that condemned status. So, building a predictive model is difficult when you have that kind of imbalance, but, using some different, sampling techniques was able to get, close to, not far above the no information rate, but close to it at least. But important to look at is some of the consistently significant variables that impact the status of the property condemnation status. One is slope that we talked about. So, properties that are on a slope that is, a higher grade than 25% are, more likely to be condemned compared to ones that are not. Older properties, so properties built further back, that sort of makes intuitive sense. Older properties are, more difficult to maintain, maybe have been abandoned longer. Those properties are more likely to be condemned as well. Census tract income, obviously most of these properties are in census tracts that have lower incomes on average. And then another interesting one was the owner type. So property owner type being a corporation is also associated with a higher chance of property condemnation. And, this could be for a couple reasons. One being that, corporations are maybe more likely to buy condemned properties because of their low acquisition costs, and because corporations maybe have they have the capital to invest in these properties and redevelop them. Or it could be that, property owners that are corporate are less likely to maintain properties since, they're not owner occupants. If they don't have renters or if it's condemned, the tax burden on them, as we'll, discuss, a little bit later, the tax burden is not high enough for them to unload that property or improve upon it. So that could be another reason. And generally using this framework, perhaps government entities may be more proactive in addressing, some of these properties that may be at risk. And also looking at the neighborhood level approach, I think, running these models at the census tract level, and then, being able to expand that to the neighborhood, even going into these neighborhoods, if you are, for example, a government entity, it's something that I've worked on, going into neighborhoods, looking at properties, maybe through built environment surveys or other methodologies to, document and, create your own data on some of these indicators and some of the physical aspects of the property as well. So, how do we jumpstart this development? Pittsburgh has, an abundance of vacant land, an abundance of condemned properties, properties that are sitting vacant. How do we get development going? Of course, Henry George famously argued for a single tax, land value tax, to incentivize putting land to a higher use. Disincentivize speculation by removing that unearned profit from just holding back on land and when waiting for value to accrue. This could potentially address some inequality, lower tax burden on some with the lowest incomes, potentially removing rents from the cost of goods for local businesses. All these things that have been talked about by George and by Georges, for a long time. Now, going into a sort of middle ground, a split rate or two rate tax system doesn't fully remove the tax on the building on property, but the goals are really much the same, as to sort of get development going, and perhaps more politically feasible than removing the property tax entirely and going just to the land value tax. Although there's definitely political hurdles to the split rate, as we'll talk about a little bit later. And so the general methodology is municipalities will tax land at a higher rate than buildings, the theoretical effect of which to encourage development of land to a higher use. Numerous studies have shown this to be the case, both in increasing building permits and increasing values of commercial structures, and increasing land value when tax rates are lowered on properties and increase on land. And basically, I wanted to recreate this with some newer data and look at Pittsburgh and some of the other Allegheny County municipalities that implement this split rate tax. So Pittsburgh has a history with, this is talking about the city. I'll talk about the county overall when I do the analysis, but Pittsburgh has an interesting history as a municipality that first, as far back as 1914, in different records expressed disdain for speculative landholding, blamed potentially for the lack of attracting more industry to the city. A split rate tax was enabled in 1913 and was generally viewed as favorable and positive in terms of development, for most of its life as policy in Pittsburgh. But countywide reassessment led to its rescission in 2001. The theme with Allegheny County, of which Pittsburgh is part, is county-wide property assessments being a point of real contention in policy, in elections, and just in general. So what had happened in 2001, there were some different expectations of the tax hike, what it would look like, how it would be split. in split rate for land and for property. There were some relevant critiques of the assessment methodology itself. Were they, being honest in the assessment of assessing the land, regardless of, what was built upon it, or were they just assessing the property and then just splitting it? And mainly also political considerations. The reassessment was to take place in a mayoral election year. There were calls for reassessment to try and display higher values to show that some policies on economic development were working, but at the same time, voters don't want higher taxes. And voters are difficult to ignore if you're running for public office, obviously. And there's different parties that get a piece of property tax: counties, city, schools. And ultimately, the repeal of the split rate policy, going back to sort of the conventional policy in Pittsburgh, was really a reflection of broken assessment and a uniquely bad assessment situation at the time, not necessarily a reflection on the effectiveness of the two-rate tax system itself. So just some history on Pittsburgh there, because Pittsburgh is unique in the analysis that I'm presenting in being the largest municipality that I looked at, but also the only one that repealed the split rate tax policy instead of implementing it. So it's important to look at this area because of the historical factors that we mentioned, and because Pennsylvania's uniqueness in being the only state that allows certain municipalities to adopt even different tax systems than the state does overall. I think in Detroit, there's a proposal recently to implement some sort of a land value tax as well, but I think for now, Pennsylvania is all we have in terms of looking at research, and that's why so many great scholarship has been done, looking at not just Pittsburgh, but Pennsylvania as a whole. So what I did was run a difference in difference, looking at, what was the result of the estimator for the tax policy? Did it improve fair market assessment values relative to other municipalities that did not implement such a policy? And these municipalities were filtered by population density and number of data entries, so the number of assessments that took place within the given year. And the reason I removed some that had too little was, it could present some artificial variance in between years of different assessments if too few assessments were taking place. The treatment group, one thing to notice is that the treatment group began already with lower property values. The municipalities besides Pittsburgh that implemented and still have split rate policy today in Allegheny County, on average, had lower property assessment values to begin with, and continue to have lower values overall. But generally, the results showed that the split rate policy estimator showed us about a 22% increase in assessed value of properties that implemented such a policy relative to the peers in the control group that had no change, and that control included Pittsburgh after the repeal of the policy. And as we can see here, I removed Pittsburgh from the treatment group, even though it was part of it prior to 2001, just to show that, after Pittsburgh, the municipalities that implemented the tax policy had lower values to begin with. Generally follow the same trends and ups and downs in assessments over time. Just some numbers. And so some of the issues were just, in terms of just the statistics in the model, a low R squared. And, I think the reason for that can be explained by, when estimating on the effect of one tax policy on the assessment value of property. Of course, I was interested in really more than anything the impact of the policy itself. So the point of the model that I ran was not to estimate the assessment value. For that, you would want something more of a hedonic approach with characteristics of the property, rooms, bedrooms, square footage and things of that nature. So I think the lower R square can be explained in that sense. I looked at a period from 1975 to 2023, where the most recent assessment data is available. It's updated pretty continuously. Parallel trends is more difficult to prove over a longer period, especially when there's sort of a staggered difference where the policy is being adopted in different years for the different municipalities. I mentioned earlier some of the years that have fewer observations in the data set might show a higher fluctuation in fair market assessed value that may not really reflect the actual movements of the market, but just the number of assessments that were taking place at the time. Future additions that I would like to add is that, for one, the inclusion of the exact ratio of the implemented split tax. Pittsburgh, over its history of being a split rate tax city, got up to as much as a 5-to-1, I think, ratio of land tax to building on the property. Knowing those exact splits in the different municipalities over time might give a better picture on how much the tax really did influence. Although the general findings of the association being positive are in line with the research and the empirical work that has been done looking at split rate taxes and on residential and commercial properties in the past. And the one other thing is the assessment data itself. One of the big benefits and why I wanted to use this data set is that it is the data that is used for tax purposes. So it's the data set and the data that is being used by municipalities to calculate taxes on properties. So when looking at the impact of a tax policy on the potential future for tax revenue, this was the data set to use. But at the same time, the base year assessment model used by the county and irregular assessments, the last countywide assessment, for example, being done in 2013, that's 10 years ago, that makes it a little bit less reliable for a type of strong empirical analysis when looking at the any kind of causal relationship, even despite the benefits of the data set on actually being the one that's used to calculate taxes. So, given now, the discussion of the history, some of the statistics and the numbers, what are some of the current trends that we're seeing in the city? One is corporate ownership, including out-of-state investors, including in some of those distressed areas I was discussing earlier. Corporate ownership, has come into the city. It's still a lower percentage total of in certain out of town owners, for example, maybe less than 1% in certain census tracts still. But looking at even post pandemic, less than 1% can still means up to maybe 1,000 or more properties.
You motherfucker.
By out-of-state investors. And one of the things that we might see with corporate ownership is the conversion from owner-occupied properties to rental property. This leads to increased power and pricing awarded to landlords. We can kind of see this in that split in median rent that I talked about earlier, and then also in a general trend of rents rising over time. We can look at census data for that. And then one of the issues also during and post-pandemic is high costs of construction, higher interest rates, higher costs of borrowing, and things of that nature, making development both for for-profit developers and for government entities, making construction more expensive um, as well. And what are some Georgia's interpretations of this? For one, land values, it's important to remember here are expected to increase over time. This isn't necessarily true as well for structures. And I think this is one of the things that really makes Pittsburgh unique in a different and really applicable lens for Henry George's theory is a declining population and housing stock. So an increase in abandoned properties, those condemned properties I discussed. Also paired with that expectation of increase in land value over time, um, really can be a case where speculation is very profitable. And that speculation, when looking at that expected future value of the increase in land, that speculative premium, um, you know, when it must be recovered by for-profit developers. This leads often to incentives for larger structures, so we can, scale out the, building, extract, some higher profit from these values. And then building at scale can be difficult when available properties are scattered, for instance. So a lot of these condemned properties aren't, all right next to each other. They're, in between, other occupied structures. They're, different in different places, scattered, throughout neighborhoods. So that those large scale redevelopments, are less likely to happen, in those cases. And then also, since the land itself isn't being produced, we're not getting any more land. The increase in demand, so population starts to increase. Younger generations and different in movers moving to neighborhoods that maybe saw a loss in population or white flight, before. Those increases in population and increases for demand for housing in those areas can only lead to increases in price, since there is no new land being produced. And then also one of the current trends when discussing all this is gentrification. And, obviously, you know, it's sort of a topic that's difficult to discuss. It's hard to define. It could be emotional at times. There's lots of opinions, and a lot of it is perspective as well. You can have an economist running a large model over many cities, trying to look at and quantify gentrification. But you could also, ask people in a neighborhood, how they feel or what they feel like is going on in their neighborhood. And that perspective is in many instances just as valuable as economic work done. And then, the question comes about too, as we discuss many of the dynamics of the low property values, some potential for flipping properties and speculators to come in. That sort of leads to naturally into a discussion of gentrification. And then, the issue we have to confront of, how is gentrification defined? How do we even look at it? And so this is just a little visual of a matrix of looking at, different literature on the topic of gentrification and the different statistics that researchers used to prove in their perspective whether or not gentrification was taking place. And as we can see, there's a variety of perspectives. A lot of times displacement is important. Our residents that were already in a neighborhood being priced out. There's potential for exclusionary displacement where high prices itself limit new people from moving into a neighborhood. So just something to keep in mind, all the different ways we can look at a topic like gentrification, and the different statistics we might look at to try and quantify it for ourselves. I tried to generalize it in sort of a general trend that we can look at for Pittsburgh, and I think it will really apply generally overall as well. But in Pittsburgh, it sort of takes the form of initial disinvestment, either through loss of population or a lack of investment in the first place. In the example of potentially looking at minority communities, for example, that disinvestment or lack of investment then leads to lower property values, lower land values, and then that brings in the opportunity eventually for investors that can cover that speculative risk and achieve high profits through the the extraction of rents of those properties. And then in general, Pittsburgh might have some exceptional risk for gentrification due to that history of decline and disinvestment, and those low acquisition costs for developers. Historical redlining certainly an issue that we've discussed, and then the general supply and demand issue. We see some tight markets a lot, where like I mentioned, that increased demand for in movers potentially, or that steady demand of everyone. There's some sense of fixed demand for housing, where everyone needs housing, and then we can see a decrease or some sort of a constant supply of housing, and the decrease can happen through the deterioration of properties, the removal of owner-occupied residents from the markets, so then increase in rental properties, then that leads to a decline in available properties for sale. And then we see an issue of trying to recover that economic rent for future investment. There's a battle really between the utility to the public of the property, the Georgia's perspective, and then the market value. And then assessments and assessing the property and actually getting that tax revenue for the city, and for the schools and the county is a whole different but tangential issue. So how do we encourage development to address vacant property and vacant lots, and acknowledge that production in its current state is driven by profit and is driven by that speculative nature to extract that rent and hope that the land value increases with minimal improvements, if any at all, to the land or the building that is upon that land. Just some current, policy trends and updates. Where is Pittsburgh today? There's really impossible to ignore political considerations of changing the way properties are assessed, or even committing to a assessment at all. Like I mentioned, the county's issue with county-wide assessments, and them being the last one being more than a decade ago. The city and the county and the public schools are reliant on these taxes. Anywhere from 20 to 40% of their budget comes from these taxes. Recently, Pittsburgh Public Schools, began a lawsuit, where the county is the defendant, arguing that there is a need for a countywide reassessment immediately. It is long overdue. And really, there's just huge political issues, and politicians reluctant to raise taxes, even if it creates what most people would think is maybe a more fair or equitable result. And so looking at the political issues that the county has had just with conducting assessments. Changing the way that properties are assessed is going to be an even bigger political challenge. And you can look at the history with Pittsburgh's repeal of split rate tax to sort of demonstrate that even further. There's also an interesting development within the city, an ordinance for a rental owner registry that's currently in court. The purpose of which is for out of town investors to be required to have some representative within the city to respond to needs of residences in rental properties. So that's being fought out in court currently. To be determined how that goes. Another potential avenue of redevelopment is the land bank. There's been some advancement even just last week in the Pittsburgh land bank, allowing it hopefully down the line, sort of starting it on that path of potentially being able to acquire properties a little bit easier, either through sheriff sale, or the ability to toss out liens, which were some hurdles for the land bank in Pittsburgh to actually begin, acquiring properties and then redistributing them. So, the land bank is one possibility for sort of streamlining that process of moving vacant or blighted properties, into a different development, into a higher use altogether. And then generally in Allegheny County, was just recently in November an election. There's a new county executive that has to tackle these issues and the issues of reassessments and all these. So many updates to come within the county and in the city in the very near future. And then finally, just to leave us with a discussion of what the future might look like. There's I talked a lot about many of the issues that Pittsburgh has, but there's really a lot of potential as well. There's a great base of community-minded groups, and in a lot of cases in many neighborhoods, although a sort of in a declining number, properties are still accessible, at times to community development groups or non-for-profit developers, and things like the land bank can help with that process and sort of having not just the city but other community groups that aren't looking for redevelopment for profit to kind of compete with the increase in out-of-town investors and things of that nature. There's the tax rates, the assessment policy, encouraging development, addressing the history, the racial disparities in lending as well, and sort of trying to create a policy that in a split rate tax policy at least, that is grounded in strong empirical work and has been shown to improve values of properties, and help with development. Something that Pittsburgh could really benefit from, and has a great infrastructure already to really see the benefits of such a policy. And then finally, addressing the supply side. New units must be affordable. When there's a discussion of an affordability crisis or a housing crisis, there's talk of increasing the supply of housing. The distinction should be made that new units must be affordable. New $1 million, condos don't necessarily help with an affordability crisis. So addressing that and acknowledging, the history, the current, role of speculation and for-profit developers, and the need to address units that will be affordable, for the future and in the long term, and looking to Henry George for the theory, not just in the potential policy formulas, but also in understanding, the current situation and, how things developed to get to a certain place, like, they are currently in Pittsburgh. So that's all I have. I want to thank everyone, for attending. You can, see my email and things if you want to ask any questions, not on the Zoom. You can shoot me an email. And also, the link to my GitHub. I'm planning on posting a lot of this stuff. I've been working with, the data and things. Planning on posting there soon.